Kind of a major league panel here for this roundtable tonight.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Any chance I have to get Michael Kennedy on the show, it's exciting. When I have Timothy Edgar on, it's always informative, and we get an expertise that is not readily available in a lot of places. When I have them both on, more or less I'm going to ask a couple questions and shut up because they really know what's happening here. This is the Friday edition. You know we don't do a rundown on Fridays because we do pre-record our Friday programs on Thursday. So if anything breaks loose on Friday news cycle-wise, we'll catch up to it next week. Thank you for joining us. Glad to have you aboard. Let's kick right into it. Obviously, this shooting incident this week has, I think, everybody kind of off the rails in a lot of ways. On a positive note, I thought the president yesterday struck the right tone.
We may have our differences, but we do well in times like these to remember that everyone who serves in our nation's capital is here because, above all, they love our country. We can all agree that we are blessed to be Americans, that our children deserve to grow up in a nation of safety and peace, and that we are strongest when we are unified.
He said the right thing. It was written for him. He stayed on prompter. Good work. He didn't remember it today, though, or Thursday, but we'll talk about that. Professor Kennedy, Professor Edgar, your expertise is vast in Europe and Ukraine and those kind of things, but you think way past that and teach way past that. 10 seconds for everybody on what you teach.
I teach sociology, and in particular I teach about the sociology of Trump and how it's changing America.
That's a new curriculum for,
yes.
for the undergrads and grads at Brown University and the Watson Institute. Of course, Tim has worked for both sides of the aisle in Washington. We label him as a cybersecurity expert, but his political instinct is second to none. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Dan.
This shooting Wednesday. Look, I'm going to give you my premise. You guys chat about it. I think we've lost our minds suggesting that this shooting has a direct relationship to the tone of political commentary in America today. People do those unless we're going to redefine that action with a semi-automatic weapon at a baseball field as tactically semi-normal, or at least hyperbolic reaction to normal things. If we're going to redefine that as that, then we can talk about political rhetoric. But he could have been mad at anybody for anything at any time, and we wouldn't be having this phony 24-hour unification conversation, which, by the way, was punctuated Thursday morning by Donald Trump suggesting the prosecutor or the special counsel witch hunt is full of bad people, which goes right back to the rhetoric everybody says they don't want. So I think we've completely misreacted to this thing. You have the floor. Guys, go.
Well, I think that's basically right. I mean, you have these kinds of shootings that are happening, and people are doing it for a variety of reasons. It's a mental health issue. It's an access to guns issue. We call it radicalization when we are talking about Muslim extremists, and yet you can see that anyone with any ideology, white, black, of color, whether they're on the left or the right or just have some crazy idea, may end up doing one of these things. And I agree with you. It's not something that's happened because of Trump or the rhetoric we have today being heated. We've had heated rhetoric before, and we've had shootings before. So this is a problem that our country has to confront.
So I would say two things in addition.
The sociologist's perspective.
Absolutely. I agree with everything that Tim says, typically, and in this moment as well. But two things. One is we always have to tie an incident as heinous as this into a larger story. There is an important moment for our country right now to tie this into a story that will make us better. I think when Trump says we all love our country, we are stronger when we are united. That's a step in the right direction. But it's the principles around which we're united. It's the principles, the quality of the country that we love that matters. So what I would then say, and picking up on your point right at the start, of course this political polarization in our country is not causing something so extreme as this in Alexandria. But if you're not part of the solution, you're actually sort of part of the problem. And when Donald Trump gets on and challenges those who are following a question of law to say that they are what?
Bad people.
Bad people. This is actually contributing to the polarization of our country that is not good for any of us.
Can I just say, I agree, but it has nothing to do with the shooting. So I don't know what is the logic that everyone just de facto assumes exists, that heinous act has a relationship to any of the points well made right here. What is it?
I think people want to blame a larger community in a lot of these cases instead of the individual who did the act. And whether it's Bernie Sanders supporters or conservative Muslims or right wingers, that's a mistake. But I think what Professor Kennedy's saying, what Mike is saying, is that you have to look at what does actually unite us as Americans, and we've seen many of those things challenged, many of those ideals and principles challenged, and so it makes it harder. I mean, President Trump said, of course, exactly the right thing. That clip you played could have been played by any president. It was presidential, and yet it sort of rings a little bit hollow when all of the other things he says, frankly, seem kind of anti-American.
Listen, I agree completely. Listen, we'll do enough Trump analysis here to choke a horse during this show, but I guess what I'm trying to suggest, and people are leaning on the idea that this guy inquired for one of the congressmen who was leaving the ball field. Who are those, Republicans or Democrats out there? Because viewers are saying, Dan, it was political. It was political. He could have asked somebody, are those straight or gay people out there? He could have said, are those Cleveland fans or Golden State Warrior fans out there? He could have said, are those, he could have done any of those things and decided that was the rationale for which he was. So that, I just think tying this political climate into that act buoys the act, by the way.
Yeah, it makes it bigger than it really is.
Yes.
Just one quick thing, it's terrorism. It's clearly terrorism. Terrorism, the definition of terrorism in the law is violence against somebody for religious or political or ideological reasons. I think the mistake is that we think that terrorism is linked to this particular political ideology that the terrorist gloms onto. Because it could be an ideology that you hate, it could be an ideology that you support. The problem is the terrorism.
You sure it's terrorism and not just somebody who's just not coping? He's had domestic violence problems. He's had all sorts of other criminal issues that he's dealing with. I don't know.
I'm making a definitional point here. Of course it's a mental health issue. I'm not saying he's connected to anybody. I'm just making a point that when you single out somebody, Republican, Democrat, when you single out somebody, hate crimes and terrorism in this sense are related. They're the same thing ultimately. They attack what we share as Americans. And when, I hate to come back to Donald Trump, but when Donald Trump says, let's stop the Muslims because then they'll stop terrorists, that's exactly wrong, right? That's why that's wrong, is because the terrorism is the use of the ideology for violence. It is not the membership in a particular group that is either the victim of it or is looking like one of the perpetrators.
The last question I had on it, then I want to get the final thought from
Sorry,
Michael.
No.
But that Bernie Sanders had to step out and say, I understand that this man was a volunteer for my campaign. Let me be unequivocal and suggest condemning. It's like, no kidding, Bernie. Of course you're unequivocally condemning the act because the act is isolated from any, social media, a lot of lefties have been really, blah, 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 and the New York Times is sponsoring a play that simulates it, and Kathy Griffin, those things add to an acidic disposition in the country. They don't necessarily end up, with what we had. So anyway.
So just to be very clear about this, ideology or group membership does not cause violence like this. But do people who are violent like this use ideology?
Yes.
Right. Yes. The answer is yes. So the question that I have, Trump is not
as
making...
an excuse, I think.
As an excuse,
right.
But to the extent that we as a country can reduce the fertility of our culture for producing hateful responses, we are therefore going to reduce the likelihood that people will use such extreme violence.
All right.
That's the point. And it's not that that membership causes, but it's that individual uses, and we got to stop that.
Okay, we'll come back and dig into the week in Washington, other than the shooting. Lots going on. Stay with us.
I don't think it's for me to say whether the conversation I had with the president was an effort to obstruct.
It's a few days ago now, right? Director Comey in his testimony. Tim and I already had conversations about this pre and post on the radio. Michael's new to this conversation on this particular subject matter. Of course, we've had Jeff Sessions sit, so we'll talk about that aspect of it coming up soon. Things move fast. I mean, Washington Post is reporting yesterday that now the investigation does kind of focus on the president via the high intel officials who will be asked questions. You wonder about the reporting and whether it's good reporting of these investigations. Donald Trump will call leaks, I'm sure, yet. And of course, as we talked in the last segment, he tweeted yesterday morning that this is a witch hunt, the most incredible witch hunt ever, whatever. Bad people doing it. I mean, by the way, it's his Justice Department, FYI. Rod Rosenstein hired this guy Mueller, who comes with impeccable resume. Have at it. I mean, what are you making of this whole thing?
So I guess, look, the obvious point here is that if we believe Director Comey, Donald Trump wasn't under investigation personally until he fired the FBI director. So he is continually digging himself in deeper and deeper, creating more and more problems for himself. And part of this is that he simply doesn't seem to understand the nature of the role that he is in. That he is the President of the United States, that he has to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That's what the Constitution says. That, the only president ever to have resigned, Richard Nixon, did so precisely because he tried to shut down an FBI investigation. And he continues to persist this way. And, we are suffering the consequences of it. But yes, I mean, I think Mueller had no choice, given how much evidence there was of interference in that investigation and then the firing, with him admitting it was because of Russia. I don't see how he could have done anything other than open up a full obstruction of justice.
Well, what's interesting is that either he's hiding something or just is so clueless about the process that what he's done to inflame the process will be that which could, A, tear the country down, or B, get him. Either one is despicably sad. It really is.
So for a long time, I was trying to figure out what motivates Trump. And I can't.
I knew you'd go to the big picture. This, I got a little taste of this before the show. You want to lay that sucker out now?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the way in which I can make sense of this now is to actually think about what America is it that we love. What is it that actually unites us? And what is it that we love? What is it that unites us? It's the rule of law. It's the Constitution. And what I'm afraid of is that Trump, unwittingly or wittingly, is trying to replace the rule of law with the rule of loyalty. When he asked the former or then FBI director to pledge loyalty to him, he was asking Comey to violate his oath to defend the Constitution.
Yet he denies that he's done it. At the same time, there's more evidence of his loyalty requests all over Kingdom Come.
I go
Who has more integrity, based on the record?
No,
I go back to the inauguration address when Donald Trump stood up there and said that he had taken an oath of allegiance to all Americans. No, he hadn't. He took an oath of allegiance to the Constitution. He was acting sort of like a traditional tribal leader. You pledge your loyalty to me and I will protect you. I'm the big man who protects you against the threats. And that's never been our tradition as Americans. I mean, obviously we're human beings. We care about all the things that my colleague knows about in terms of how we react with leadership. But what's made us distinctive and exceptional is that, no, the president takes an oath of allegiance to the Constitution, not to the nation. And the nation doesn't, have loyalty to the president. They have loyalty to the office because it's part of the Constitution.
Here's the, since I'm going to take your deep thinking, not that that wasn't deep, I'm going to take your deep thinking and double down on it. I'm not convinced that he ever wanted to be elected, that it was brand building, that it was, and the loyalty versus law thing, he probably doesn't know how to respond to that question because he's still operating in Trump brand mode, which is and his business model, which is all loyalty driven. I mean, there's some laws he had to abide by. And he's leading the league on suing and being sued, by the way, right, as a private citizen. But I'm not sure that he's purposefully trying to usurp the Constitution with a loyalty, totalitarian rewrite of American presidency, blah, blah, blah. I think he's just stuck. I think he's stuck playing a role of the President of the United States with his old model in place.
You just made me see something I hadn't seen before. And that's this, that I think it's not only that he's acting out the CEO of the country role. I actually think he won by defying all the rules. He won by articulating the frustrations of the forgotten. So he has assumed to himself the expression of what the nation needs. And in the process has lost the sense of what the nation is. The nation is not an individual. The nation is a society ruled by law.
I would just replace laws with never knew it. Never knew it.
Quite likely, and look,
it's like we're writing an epilogue here. I mean, he's still the President of the United States.
Well, that's absolutely
we all
right.
feel like the train is heading in a certain direction.
Yeah.
That he continues to create on his own. His own inertia provides the problems that he has.
Well, yes, I think that's the point, is that he continues to double down on problems. Look at his lawyer, Mark Kasowitz, acting as a personal lawyer and blurring all the boundaries. That, for Mark Kasowitz to say, oh, Jim Comey, he leaked privileged information, he has no right to say that. He's not the White House counsel. He's not the president. This is not Trump University.
Nor was it accurate, by the way.
It was not accurate, absolutely. And so, he kind of brings in this guy that he's used to dealing with the Trump organization, has no understanding of the constitutional privileges involved with the presidential office, or what executive privilege means or doesn't mean. And he likes him. It's clear. I think he feels like this guy's going to come in and fight for me. I don't want these Washington lawyers who are going to give me a lecture about what executive privilege is. I want my, fighting litigator who's, helped me with real estate deals in New York. And that is not working. And I think part of the problem is that he doesn't understand that it's not working. He can recognize that something isn't working, but every time he does something, it makes it worse. Bringing in Mark Kasowitz has made things infinitely worse for him. I mean, the attacks on Comey are just additional evidence for Mueller of obstruction. They're not helping him.
And then we get the guys like Jeff Sessions, who seemingly this week, in my judgment, looked like he was just caught in something. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
I have never met with or had any conversation with any Russians or any foreign officials concerning any type of interference with any campaign or election in the United States. I recuse myself from any investigation into the campaign for president, but I did not recuse myself from defending my honor against scurrilous and false allegations.
Look, Jeff Sessions is not my political cup of tea necessarily. I agree with him on some things. But he looks like a guy who's just caught in the problem of having to work for Donald Trump. I don't care if he forgot whether he bumped into Kislyak once or twice. I mean, the senator from Minnesota, Al Franken, tortured him with that for a couple of months. Irrelevant. But the Comey and the idea that he tried to pull off I recused because I was actually recused by sitting in the office and doing nothing. You just didn't know I was recusing. What in heaven's name? It doesn't seem... He looks like a guy who's caught up in being the Attorney General for Donald Trump, thinking it was a good thing to do for the country, and wondering, what the hell am I doing here? Does that make any sense to you?
I think so, and I guess my biggest concern, both with Sessions and then earlier with Comey on some of this, is we've lost, again, what's the big issue here? A foreign power tried to interfere with our election last year. This is a major, major national security concern. And the Attorney General of the United States doesn't seem to have any understanding or ability to react to this. One of the top national security officials.
That's a good point. I mean, the truth of the matter, listen, the United States of America has fiddled with elections abroad itself. You know, so there are, but this one, you know, on us, we do have a little bit of a double standard in terms of this kind of thing.
Absolutely, that's true.
So let's not kid ourselves. But yes, I'm not saying that the ambassador stuff's not really important, but I'm guessing that he's not part of a collusionary plot.
No, well, we don't know that, but there's certainly no evidence.
No.
There's certainly no evidence.
Others in the campaign, maybe.
You know, right? I think Mueller is looking at that, at who may or may not have had any contacts with the Russians. But I guess my key point is, what are we going to do to stop them next time? You know, how are we going to focus our attention now that we've been distracted by this firing of the FBI director? You know, all those conversations that Trump had with Comey, and they asked him this, one of the more chilling questions was, did he ever ask you how to protect the country against Russian interference? Same thing with the Attorney General.
So to your point,
and the answer was no. The answer was no.
To your point, because we're short on time, do we get to the answer of how do we protect the country with Donald Trump still in office, while A, he doesn't identify that the problem exists, has never taken responsibility as the executive to be able to say we need to fix this? I mean, do you have to extract him from the process in order to be able to get to that question?
I didn't think so before because I was impressed by his appointment of Mattis, McMaster, and others when we finally moved into a more professional defense security establishment. But what is striking to me when we see someone with the record that Sessions had to become someone so evasive of legal questions as an attorney general,
invoking pre-executive privilege,
invoking something that's entirely mythological,
right,
and then winds up finding succor in jokes about James Bond,
right,
when in fact Kamala Harris was the person, along with Jack Reed, on that Sessions hearing who showed the most professionalism in pursuing the question of truth.
Don't get me started on the Boys Club double standard, where the senator feels like they can shut her down.
That was really extraordinary. I've testified in front of Congress. Members of Congress can be deferential. They can be very aggressive. Right. They can cut you off. Every witness knows they can cut you off.
All right. I only have 10 seconds for each of you. Quick, where are we going?
We're going to impeach Trump if he manages to survive that long.
I just hope we can find a way to protect ourselves against the Russians, you know, whether or not that happens, and I don't think we can wait around for that to happen or depend on that.
Never enough time with you guys. Thank you, fellas. Appreciate it. Be right back. Wow, that was heavy. We'll talk a little golf, Northeast Am on Monday, and Patricia Morgan, who says she might run for governor, the minority leader in the State House, on Tuesday. You have a great weekend. Enjoy Father's Day. Good night.